So, as I told you in the welcome this morning, I get really lighthearted, fun topics the next couple of weeks. And so I'll start off with a really light, easy question. When in your life have you felt most alone? Maybe after a diagnosis? Maybe after a moment of loss? Maybe literally after someone walked out the door? Maybe right now. For me, those moments that I can recall with great clarity don't happen for the most part when I'm literally alone. It had very little to do with that. Now, it might for you. But for me, the memories that I can draw on happened when I felt isolated and alone right in the midst of other human beings, often a lot of other human beings. Alone in a school, an office, a family, a relationship, a church. And most of that came from the nagging sensation that I'm the only one here who feels this way. And if they find out about it, I'll really be alone. Maybe just me. But that's a common point of my experience. It's that feeling, is it just me? Am I the only one? Surely it must be. And a good antidote for that is to go to a comedy club. At least one of my favorite comedians, Pete Holmes, suggests that like good theater or good music, a good concert or church at its best, the experience of sitting in a room of other flesh and blood human beings and giving voice to what terrifies us and someone saying it out loud is salvific. He talks about the fact that he often opens his shows with a ridiculous premise to see if someone else in the room resonates with it. He'll come out onto the stage and say, you know how you're driving down the road at night alone on a dark road? It's good if it's dark and preferably if there's fog. You don't see any other cars driving and it's just you and you've been there for a while and suddenly you get the sneaking suspicion that someone's in the car with you. An axe murderer crouched in the back seat ready, and so you keep driving and you think, no, I'm being silly, and then all of a sudden your hand reaches back, and as you're driving, you're feeling around just in case, and what on earth would you do if you got a face in your hand, he says. And he said that that's not always the case for everybody. Not everyone's had that thought. But there's always somebody in the club who goes, uh-huh. And to him, it is tangible evidence that no matter how odd your mind gets, how fearful or anxious or terrified or dirty or mean, you're not alone. Somebody else, each laugh at a joke about human frailty and struggle, he says, is a vote for, me too. He said that before he goes to a bad gig, particularly in the beginning of his career, where he'd be playing a technical college in Boise in the basement of their annex building at noon, he'd be driving alone thinking, this is going to be terrible. I don't know these people. I have nothing in common with them. They've never heard of me. And he said as he drove, he would remind himself, they're all going to die. I am going to die. I don't know them. I'm not studying what they're studying. I'm not studying to be an HVAC technician. But I bet we all share a knowledge and perhaps a little anxiety of the fact that we're temporary. My guess is that while I don't know anything about these people at this club I'm driving to, all of them in some way struggle with their own body, their intelligence, their inability to control their actions as much as they would, their addiction, their loss, and so it's going to be okay, as long as that's where I meet them. And then when they laugh, I'll know, me too. So that's the question that you asked us in some way. About 6 or 7 of the 40 questions we got revolved around the theme, why am I alone? I thought it was so interesting. It's painful, but honest. That a critical mass of you, when we said, what do you want to know this summer? What do you want us to address and preach about and talk about and reflect on? The question that we got back is, why am I alone? Not why are we alone? Why me? Some were explicit. Is there something about me? We got one that said, does God want me to be alone? No. That's a quick sermon for that one. But in some way or another, there's a critical mass of people, at least who voiced it, and I always guess when 2 or 3 people ask the question, there's more of us. Why do I feel alone? It became apparent to me when reflecting on this question and your lives that there's a tremendously important difference between loneliness and solitude. So as a person who lives in a house with dogs and little kids and a spouse whose job is to relate to other human beings all day, a question I often ask myself is, why am I not alone? There's like that 15-second stretch between putting one kid in the car and the other that's like a vacation. And you go, oh, what I would do for a few minutes. But loneliness has little to do with the literal fact of being alone in a room or a town or anything else. Solitude, it seems to me, is something that you choose where loneliness isn't. Solitude we seek out, and it can be creative and nourishing and fertile. Solitude is what Henry David Thoreau was talking about going, I went into the woods to live deliberately. Nobody chased him out there. He wasn't hiding. Most of the great spiritual teachers we read about intentionally take those periods. And by coincidence, most of them do it for about 40 days. At least Jesus and the Buddha. Both 40 days alone. And they're not really alone. In both of their narratives, they're visited by outward or inner demons, however you want to interpret it, who say, do you really want to be doing this? Solitude can be rich. Solitude and loneliness are also not the same thing as knowing deep down in our bones that nobody else can do the work of your life for you. I often look to Stephen Sondheim as a spiritual teacher. And in Into the Woods, there's a refrain in one of my favorite songs that says, you decide what's right, you decide what's good, you decide alone. But no one is alone. And I think he's right. You decide alone. That's true. No one else is going to make the decision of whether you're using your temporary life in the way that you can for you. Nobody. No one is going to choose whether you actually love the person that you live with or not. No one is going to choose whether you feel like you're living with authenticity for you but you. And when your life is over, and you close your eyes for the last time, and you join the community of saints, no one gets to do your death for you, but you. And yet, we are all connected in a vast and mysterious web of all existence, which has existed, exists, and will exist for all time. There is no literal matter between us. And every scientific discovery shows that we're more connected than we could possibly be. And that the great truth of almost all spiritual teaching is that the self is not what you think it is. So, you're not alone. And almost every critical moment that you face, you'll have to do yourself. Loneliness, on the other hand, is something we don't choose. It's something that gets chosen for us by circumstance. Someone walks out the door, or the body that we inhabit is said to be shameful by the society that we live in? It's a feeling of desiring more intimacy than we currently have. And as Olivia Lang describes it, it often happens in the presence of other human beings. It's particularly easy to happen in the presence of other human beings because to our eyes, everyone else looks like they get it. But there's something wrong with me. She talks about that cycle, what the Buddhists would call the second arrow. The idea is that if you get shot with an arrow, it hurts, and then if you blame yourself for getting shot by an arrow, it does nothing good. And then you blame yourself for getting mad at yourself for getting shot by an arrow. And you recognize this, right? So what happens is we walk through our days or move through the world in a way where we say, gosh, I feel like it's not enough. That I'm not enough. And I say, well, that's odd. He or she doesn't feel that way. Boy, what did I do? I guess it's wrong that I'm feeling that way. I really should get my act together, but now I'm criticizing myself and I'm falling into a shame spiral, and that's not good. And, well, there's something wrong with this whole system. Or just me, probably. And instead of voicing that feeling aloud, what we so often do is just kind of silently sit with it for, 50 or 60 years. Okay, you know nothing about this. I'm so glad. But what happens is you end up sitting across the table from someone you're married to for 50 years alone. Or inhabiting a city that you're afraid to be honest in, or a church that you're afraid to be honest in, and all of a sudden there's a room full of people and everybody's kind of holding on to this secret. And modern life, in our cultural context, doesn't make this any easier. I know you know that. The narrative about who belongs and who doesn't is explicit right now, to the highest levels of power. Whose bodies are a burden to our society and whose aren't. How could we not be afraid to be ourselves in such a time? Our cultural context worships individual heroes, often white, often male, often straight, for their rare ability to suddenly solve all of their and the world's problems alone. Even religious narratives of Jesus or the Buddha ignore that they're supported by these vast communities. And look what we do with somebody like Thoreau. I'm talking to Unitarians now. We love Henry David Thoreau. I named my kid after him. I love him too. We take our kids on a literal pilgrimage to Walden Pond. And the whole book, he never says he was by himself. If you haven't read it, go back. It's really interesting. Throughout the whole book, he says, I wasn't by myself. I went into town to get something to eat. My mom did my laundry. He said there were literally other people living at Walden Pond. And history shows it. There were other people who lived out there. And he never says that he wasn't. And yet, when I hear critiques of him, the first thing I hear from self-sufficient, rational, liberal-minded folks like us is, well, he said he could do everything by himself, but did you know his mom did his laundry? Well, yeah, he never said she didn't. But for some reason, we want to find that weakness. You couldn't do it alone. We tried, but you couldn't do it. Our models of who shapes and controls power are often one person. And in that kind of place where we worship an individual and we're told that we're not enough, the calculus doesn't add up. Our societal structure based in consumerism is needing you to feel like you're not enough. It needs it. It craves it. The same system which tells you that you're not attractive enough will sell you something that promises to fix that problem for you. The same system that tells you to be afraid and hide in your home will sell you a system to make you feel safer, or take something or drink something or buy something. And I'm not alone, because I know that in those moments of well, I don't like this feeling. I have same day ordered something from Amazon that I thought was going to fix that problem. So here we are. Perhaps in a time where the earth is more populated than it's ever been by human people, more connected than we've ever been, and in some very tangible ways, more isolated from meaningful human connection. I know that you know this already. But the question that you ask me is such an important one. Why are we, or why am I, or why is it so easy to be alone? And I'm so proud of whoever it was turned in those questions. We got a lot of good questions, and many of them were kind of informational, and that's okay. We expected that. What does God mean, or why do we pray? These are things that Unitarian church members want to know, and we can give pretty good answers to those questions. But this question admits something that some of us try to forget in a Unitarian context. That just because we think we're so smart and so enlightened, and just because we read the New York Times before we came to church, the human condition didn't disappear when we walked in the door. No matter how many degrees we have, no matter the numbers we like to quote about how our kids graduate with SAT scores or all this stuff, it doesn't change a bit about whether or not we experience loneliness, addiction, loss, whether we find it hard to live in community, whether we struggle with our own bodies or sense of self-worth. We're just like everybody else. And that's good news. And that question, I'm so proud of you for holding up, says that out loud. Us too. Me too. That question takes us out of this theoretical head game and says we're talking about people in the room. We're talking about you and me. Look, I'm in a very privileged position here. I'm standing on the center of the stage. The lights are literally on me. I wear clothes to show you that I'm special. My business card says, the Reverend Aaron White. Who gets to do that? That's amazing. I'm in a privileged position, and yet it is an isolating one. I can remember a Sunday when I wasn't preaching, but I was sitting in the chair, and a friend of mine, one of my best friends whose child is a week younger than mine, he had a child who died. I hadn't cried about it yet. I was sitting in the chancel, and somebody was singing a song, and I felt it. Oh no, this is when it's going to happen. I'm about to weep on the chancel in front of all of them. And I immediately knew that whatever experience I had couldn't be expressed, or that was what that part of me was saying. And it was this embodied sense of like, I don't care what you feel, shut it down, don't tell them. It's not ministerial. They're going to ask what's wrong. You're going to have to talk to people about it. You're going to have to admit that you sometimes cry. All of it, boom, 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 terribly isolating. My guess is that if I, like Captain Privilege, straight, white, male, easygoing, well-educated, not hard on the eyes minister guy, my guess is that if I experience that even in a privileged position, so many people must be terribly afraid and lonely. So many, so many. The far extreme of that experience and isolation and distance from our emotions and our human experience, the feeling that I'm the one who doesn't belong here, can end up with tremendous consequences. We're not talking about theory, we're talking about people. The most recent data shows that 4% of the U.S. population, 4%, has suicidal ideation in a given year. And those statistics are much higher for some groups. And now we're really not talking about theory. What that means is in this church where we have, on average, 500 people attend every Sunday, 20 of us here today have considered leaving life in the last year. Not 20 abstract people, 20 people who are sitting in this church today. So when we train new ushers and greeters and we tell them, you know, you've got one of the most important jobs in the church, we mean it. People experience whether this is a place that will meet them with joy in their full humanity way before they ever hear the music or whatever kind of thing we've got to say. To someone who has wondered whether or not they will continue living, coming at the door and going, "Hi, Sue, my name's Aaron. I'm glad you're here today," is tangible, practical theology. It's no joke. It brings us back to one of the truths that I didn't have to go to seminary to learn, and you might not be that impressed by. Kindness is real important. Kind of the most important. As good as our programs might be, as qualified as I think the clergy are, as good as anything we ever do, kindness bridges a gap of isolation like nothing else. And I don't just mean kindness of kind of a friendly demeanor. I mean learning to befriend the whole of the human experience. Because when we cultivate the ability to stop shaming ourselves for being human, to stop hiding and isolating from other people, chances are we don't cause others to hide either. I know that often when I'm hurt, I lash out by making other people feel bad. When I feel like I need to hide, I often say or do things that would require other people to do the same. And if we cultivate the ability to say, shame, friend, fear, friend, normal, loneliness, friend, normal, we don't have to hide and others don't either. It's a little like being in a comedy club, or at least when we do it well. Hopefully, we are always as good as a comedy club. Because every time you show up and there's 400 people all going, I know that, then the 2 or 3 people in the room who are thinking it's just me get tangible evidence that it's not. And it matters whether you show up. This is not just a good pitch for church attendance. It matters. Because if there are 15 of us gathered in the room going, yeah, everybody experiences this, it's not very believable. But when there's 500 people in the room, it matters. And that's why you showing up is a blessing no matter who's preaching or what the topic is or what the music's going to be that day. When you show up in the room, you provide evidence that we are not alone. You become a blessing to others. Every time you nod your head or wipe away a tear or laugh at human frailty, it is wonderful evidence that it's not just you, not just me. Our great and terrifying task is not to try and get more than one human being in a room together. If people in a room together was the solution for loneliness, we'd all be running off toward Thanksgiving dinners with our families and all sorts of other examples. People in a room together is not the answer to loneliness. Authentic, decent, loving, vulnerable, honest people is what forms community out of a crowd. And so my challenge to you, knowing as you now know that there's a critical mass of people in this room and in this church community who wonder if it's just them. My challenge to you is to befriend the parts of yourselves that you would hide away and live in such an honest and authentic presence with these people that they would know no one has to hide and no one is alone. May it be so, and amen.